Me okay? I had a question for you before we get started. Has anybody seen one of these laying around? One of these books, The Minor Prophets? No. Edward McCormickey? I lost mine. So I had to buy another one. But the problem is, I had a bunch of notes in my old one. And I don't remember exactly what I know. You haven't seen it?
Did you ever go in the doctor's room?
No, I didn't look there. Maybe I'll look that.
There's a number of books in there. You look around.
Okay. In the meantime, if anybody sees a book like this laying around, it could be anywhere from here to my house. I don't know. I will. There's a prize, by the way. There's a reward. You know what it is? It's a new book. I just want the one with my notes in it. All right. Well, you got one too, Bill. I bought one of these for you. It looks a little bit different because it's an older version, I think.
You are live.
Nathan can edit this out. That's okay. All right. So we're going to finish up this chiasm today, guys. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm a little bit behind. Oh, no, we're almost done here. So we're going to finish up this call to seek the Lord, and then we're going to finish up the lamentation, and that's going to be the whole chiasm. Remember, we slowed way down when we got to this chiasm because Amos slows down intentionally in his story, and he just emphasizes a bunch of stuff that he's already told us. And we're getting to the point where we're going to pick up a little bit of speed here after this. But this chiasm that he throws right in the middle of his story is super important, and he brings out a bunch of biblical principles from this. Oh, you know what? I got my wrong notes here. That's for Elisa. Yeah. Yeah, sorry. We're still on the same spot. All right. So remember we were talking about this remnant theme that Amos has given us. And he doesn't name it right away. He describes it first, just like the other biblical authors do with their meta themes. They describe it and they name it. Okay? And we're given little pieces at a time. And we're not given everything all at once. We got to sort of parse these things out and look at them holistically over long periods of time. And that's what Amos does. He describes it in two places. And then when he gets to the end of this chiasm, he gives it a name. He calls it a remnant. Okay? So remember, seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you, as you have said, hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. Now this is really interesting, isn't it? Amos gives us a choice, right? Seek and live. Seek good, seek God, do good, right? And live. He gives us a choice there. But then by talking about the remnant, he basically takes that choice away. Like the destruction, the judgment, the lamentation have already come, right? God has proclaimed sovereignly this destruction is going to happen. It doesn't matter. That's what the remnant implies, a total, or not a total, but a collective destruction. Okay? Now you could look at the previous verse and say, now wait a minute, I thought you said that we would live. The Lord would be with us. But as he described earlier in the chapter, not all of us, just a remnant. Just a tenth is going to be the remnant. Okay? It's a small remnant. Now, we're meant to sort of struggle with this. Okay, this is a difficult concept for us to wrap our minds around. You could actually make an argument here, and some people have, that this last line actually belongs in the last section of this chiasm. It belongs in the lamentation because it's a direct reference to the lamentation of the previous, of the beginning part of the chiasm. The city that went out 1,000 will have 100 left. A remnant, right? This is the concept. How many times, and something that's related to this, how many times is God referred to as the Lord of hosts? Especially in the prophets, right? What does that mean, Lord of hosts? Is he working at? Yeah. Is he working at Applebee's? How does the New Living Translation translate that? Oh, I thought you knew. It's the God of heaven's armies. Okay, this word host, this is a military term. Okay, this is describing God as a general of armies, of military forces. Okay, this is God going to work out a judgment. Okay, that's why a lot of these prophets use this term. Okay, you see this mostly in the prophets, the judgment prophets. Okay, so this remnant, this is not a common word in the Bible. It's only used 66 times in the Old Testament, and you can determine if that's a coincidence or not. What's the number of man? If you're studying numerology, it's 6, right? Remember Lamech? If Cain was avenged 6 times, Lamech, even worse, is going to be avenged 66 times, or 6 times 60, or something like that. Okay, I'm not drawing any lines here, but I mean it could be a coincidence, or maybe it's not. Okay, and this is always used in reference to people. This is never the remnant of the cereal in the cupboard or the remnant of milk. Okay, you guys ever have that where you go in the refrigerator and there's like this much milk here? It's like, who would do that? It's usually me. Okay, this word remnant, she'arith, is always used in describing people, just the human element, okay? Now remember how we talked about Amos possibly being one of the first of these covenantal lawyers or covenantal watchdogs? This is important, and it comes up here because we see a lot of these biblical principles in their infancy, right? We don't have a whole lot of remnant themes described in the Bible up until now. But once you get to Amos, you see it in Isaiah, you see it in Jeremiah, you see it in Hosea, Ezekiel. Zechariah talks about it. I think Malachi talks. A lot of them talk about it. It's frequent. So up until Amos, chronologically, this word's used twice. And then it's used 63 times after Amos. Okay? And remember, I'm talking chronologically. Isaiah actually comes before Amos in the Bible, but just the way that we order it, okay? Amos chronologically comes, he's in the 8th century, okay? He comes before Isaiah. Now, I thought that this might be the first time that this word's used, actually, but it's not. Okay, Amos is just picking up on the previous prophets, particularly Moses and Samuel. Now, it would be reasonable to think that he's the first one to use this word, but he's just riffing off of the things that Moses has wrote about already, and Samuel, and 2 Samuel that we're going to look at. Now, do you remember me saying that this is the same story told over and over and over again in a little bit different way and in more details each time? You remember me saying that ever? That's true. By the time we get to Jesus, we've literally been told this same story several times over. And each time we've been told this story, we're given more details. All right, we're getting closer and closer to this justification theme, this remnant theme. These themes are described to us in more detail the closer we get to Jesus. And then when we do get to Jesus, we're like, oh, well, that's what justification is. That's what this remnant is. Okay? It's bringing us to transcendent ideas slowly, which is the best way to learn these principles. We'll see this again next week, actually, when we talk about this Day of the Lord concept. This Day of the... How many people have heard the Day of the Lord before? Who talks about that? Almost everybody. A lot of people talk about that in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But the first time those words are used specifically, right next to each other, is where? Amos. He's the first one to do it. Okay? So we see this concept of the Day of the Lord in its infancy, but he describes it to us, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Joel pick it up and give us more breadcrumbs and just bring us a little bit closer to Jesus, in the actual day of the Lord. Okay? So that's what we're going to talk about next week. So this isn't the first time that this word she'arith gets used. It's actually the third time. And I want to talk about the first two times that it's used first, because it's very typical. Who do you think the first person is that uses this word? She'arith, remnant. I told you, yeah, Moses. I told you last week, didn't I? It's you could say two things. You could say Moses or Joseph. Whatever. It's really typical here. This is the first time this word's used. Now, isn't this really interesting? You might think that it's Noah, right? Because Noah, God preserved a remnant in Noah's day, right? But again, Moses is just describing this thing for us. He's not naming it. He doesn't name it until he gets to Joseph. So when Joseph brings his brothers back, they're all really worried, aren't they? Because they know what they did to Joseph. They almost killed him. They beat him up. They took his clothes. They put him in a pit. Then they sold him into slavery, right? And what does Joseph say here? Now remember, in the story of Joseph, who is Joseph? He's Jesus. He's a type of Christ, right? Maybe one of the biggest. Him and Daniel are two very big types here, okay? So what does Joseph say to his brothers? He says, don't be hard on yourselves. Don't be angry with yourselves, what you've done. It wasn't you that did that to me. It was God who sent me there. And God sent me here to preserve a she'arith for the people, for God, a remnant on the earth. So survivors were to be kept and saved from the famine. Now that's really interesting, I think. I mean, isn't that sort of a foreign concept of the sovereignty of God? Isn't that weird? I mean, that Joseph thinks that way, that it's not the perpetrators that did that to him, it's God. Now, we don't think that way about the sovereignty of God, almost ever, right? When we have bad things happen to us and bad things come into our lives, we don't think that it's God. We think that it's Satan, or we think it's somebody else. We don't see the will of God holistically, the way that the prophets sometimes do through God, or the way that Jesus saw the will of God. We don't see things that way. We want to blame somebody else and say, that's evil and that's definitely not God. But sometimes God uses us in our sin and sinfulness and wickedness. He uses that, just like he used Nebuchadnezzar, Pharaoh, right? He uses that stuff. That's a really interesting way to think about the sovereignty of God that Joseph shows us here. And this is something that we can really learn a lot from, I think. So you see, to Joseph and to Amos, it's not us at all who are in control. We think that we are a lot of times. It feels that way, doesn't it? But according to Joseph, it's God. God even uses us in our wickedness to carry out his sovereign will, okay? To preserve, in particular, in this case, Genesis 45, to preserve a remnant on the earth. Now, the second time is used in 2 Samuel, okay? Now, when I first learned that this word, she'arith, was used 2 times before Amos, I was really excited because I think, well, I can look at the word twice and understand it. I was very discouraged when I learned this is the second time because this is one of the most complex conversations that happens in the book of Samuel. First thing I did was I took out Steve July's notes. If you don't remember, a few years ago, he did a series through 2 Samuel, and then through Samuel. And then one of the first things he said in his notes was, this is a very complex conversation. I'm like, oh, man. So I struggled through this. Keep in mind this is complex. We're going to fly over this very high altitude, okay? We're not going to look at this whole conversation in detail. We're just going to look at the parts that we need to know around this word, okay? This is very complex. Now, what happens here is David has some sons, Amnon and Absalom, right? Amnon is the son of promise, or the son of, he's the oldest, right? He is David's firstborn, where the kingdom was going to go to, right? The firstborn. That's where his kingdom was going to go, right? Now, what does he do, Amnon? Do you remember? He did a bad thing. He raped Tamar, yeah. And then he just discarded her and threw her away, right? Ruined her life. Tamar's brother, right? And Tamar was Amnon's half-sister or whatever. And then Tamar's full brother from the same mother, Absalom, what did he do? He lured Amnon away and he killed him, right? And the consequence of that, the penalty of that was death, right? So he fled to a different city. And then we're told that the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon. He was consoled. He comforted himself. Another way that's translated, I forget the translation, but is the time of mourning was over. What word is that? The green. Nachem. Remember? Nachem. You remember? It's Nachem. It's Nachem. That word that God uses over and over again. He comforts himself. He mourns for himself. He breathes deeply, right? That is that word, and it's used in a very typical way, okay? Right? He didn't repent, right? He didn't change his mind. He comforted himself, all right? And then, what does Joab do? You can say whatever you want about Joab, but he's a true patriot, isn't he? I mean, he's for the kingdom, right? He just doesn't know that he should be for the heavenly kingdom and not for an earthly kingdom. He's looking for the kingdom and the dynasty of David. So he finds this woman from Tekoa. Where was Amos from? Remember where Amos was from? Tekoa. Yeah. Less than 200 years after this event, right? He probably knew about the story. Okay? He might have known some of the people involved in this story. So Joab gets this woman from Tekoa, a wise woman, and what does she do under Joab's discretion and plan? He tricks David, right? He puts the words into this woman's mouth, and she describes a situation where she says that she had two sons. They were fighting in the field. One killed the other one, and the people want to kill her other son. That's her only son, but she doesn't want her name and her husband's name to be extinguished. She needs a remnant for her line, okay? She needs a remnant. So David shows her grace and mercy and says that he will be forgiven, okay? This woman just makes up this story. David doesn't know yet that he's being tricked, all right? He allows her line to not be cut off. Remember that. Her line is not cut off because of the king here. So David shows mercy on this woman for the sake of her line, her heritage, okay? Then this turns into David preserving his line after he finds out that Joab tricked him, right? He knew, once he figured it out, he knew it was Joab that did this, okay? Totally fits the character of Joab, I think. So David's line, his heritage, which is Absalom, was preserved, right? Why is it important that David's line, his lineage, his heritage, why is it important that is preserved? Christ, right? Yes. That's where the seed's going to come from. More specifically to that, though, what just happened in chapter 7? 7 chapters before this. God promised David a dynasty that would reign forever, right? He's talking about the kingdom of heaven here. That's got to happen. If David's line gets extinguished, that's not going to happen, okay? There's got to be a remnant, right? Now, the Lord promises David, so the Lord promised David this eternal kingdom. But how will this remnant be preserved? What is the method that it will be preserved? Will it be preserved by tricking David? Will it be preserved by Joab? Will it be preserved by the methods of David that he uses, right? And Absalom here? What happens to Absalom, ironically? Yes. More thoroughly, what happens is he rebels and transgresses against his dad, the king, right? He musters up these forces. David has to flee the city. He's running and hiding. And then his hair gets caught in a tree. And who kills him? The architect of this whole debacle. That's ironic, isn't it? I mean, that's ironic. So how does this remnant get preserved? It's not the will of man. It's the will of God. Okay? It's the will of God. And how does God work? Mysterious ways. Through our own sin. How did God work? Who was the son that took over for David? And where did he come from? Bathsheba. One of the worst times morally in David's life. God took that, and that's how he preserved the remnant. The remnant's not preserved through our methods and our means. Isn't that amazing? Now, again, this is just to the 30,000-foot view, okay? It's a very complex conversation. The remnant is totally and completely in the hands and the will of the Lord. Remember Abimelech, one of the sons of Gideon? What did he do? He declared himself king and killed all of his brothers. He tried to extinguish his line so he had no competition. Now, if that sounds familiar, it wasn't the first time it happened, right? Jehoram, one of the kings of Judah, did the same thing, right? And God didn't end it there. He never cut that line off. He used that to bring the seed of Jesus, okay? God saved a remnant through all of that whole mess. He preserved the seed through that whole terrible mess. The remnant is saved and preserved by God and Him alone. It's not us. It's not even David. It's definitely not Joab, right? Remember what happened to Absalom, right? That's what happens when we take things in our own hands. Now, you could look at this remnant theme in a whole bunch of other places, but I think a good place to land is Romans 11, because there's a two-paragraph section here where Paul sort of describes this in the context of the Old Testament, and he does a more thorough job than you see in some of the other places. So I just sort of want to read this all together. I asked then, this is the beginning of chapter 11, I asked then, has God rejected His people? By no means, right? Absolutely not. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected His people, whom He foreknew. Do you not know what the Scriptures say of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets. They have demolished your altars, and I alone am left. And they seek even my life now. This is in 1 Kings chapter 19, right after the whole thing on Mount Carmel, right? And then like that whole thing happened that we talked about thoroughly, right? And then evil King Ahab and Jezebel, they were they were chasing him. But what does God say to him? He says, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bent the knee, or who have not bowed the knee. What is 7,000? What's 1,000 in numerology? We've talked about this before. When I say, what is 7,000 equivalent to in English? When I say this all the time, okay? When I say, oh, there's a million, or there's a ton. When I say that, am I ever talking about a million? Or am I ever talking about 2,000 pounds? I never am. Okay? That's not the way the word is typically used. In the biblical context, that's the way the word thousand is used. It's a multiplier. It just means a lot. Okay? What's the word seven? What's the number 7? The number 6 is the number of man. The number 7 is the number of God. So some of the ways that's translated in the Bible is complete, or fullness, or totally. He's preserving Himself, the full remnant. Okay? Everybody. Right?
The number 10 is also like the number of judgment. It's 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the third power. That 1,000 is significant in that way, also being a very complete number.
Oh, okay. Good. I didn't know that. But that totally makes sense. Yeah. So that's what He's doing here. So, for verse 5, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by what? Grace, right? Chosen by grace. That's important. And then he goes on to juxtapose grace and works. But if it is by grace, it is no longer the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace, right? You see how he juxtaposes those two things? You can't have grace and works, okay, or grace and merit. If you merit something, you can't have grace because you deserve it, right? If I go to work and then I earn my money, right? You can't graciously give me, right? They're juxtaposed. They're in opposition. Those two things are mutually exclusive concepts. You can't merit favor and then get grace, okay? So how is the remnant chosen? By grace. How is the remnant chosen in the Old Testament? The same way. By grace. The same exact way. This is not new, is it? This is that word in the Hebrew that Paul is riffing off of here. First time this word's used in Genesis 6. Now, why did God choose Noah? Favor. Undeserved favor. Grace, right? It wasn't because of merit, right? Before we're told anything about Noah, other than his name, God gives him grace. He found grace in the eyes of the Lord. The same thing is said about Abraham in 18. The same thing is said about Lot in 19. And not Lot is this concept of the Gentiles being grafted in, right? It's not just the ethnic people of Israel that are going to get grace. It's everybody. And that's what Lot is a representative of, the Gentile remnant that is going to be grafted in. We're going to get grace too, right? Praise God. And then the same thing said about Joseph, who is the type of what? Yes. Okay. So isn't this really interesting, the way the Bible works? The Bible tells us a story, and then we're told about all these little, the individuals, how these concepts play out in the lives of individuals and specific people. But then it zooms out and it looks at nation groups, right? It goes from Noah to Babel, right? And all of these nations and the way nations move around the earth. But then it goes from Noah, Abraham, Lot, Joseph, all to the nation of Israel, right? Now, this word is used to describe the nation of Israel 3 times in Exodus here. Only 3 times. 3 times. Also significant, right? And I will give this people, in the burning bush, God's talking to Moses right here, okay? I will give these people favor or grace in the sight of the Egyptians. Right in front of them, I'm going to do this, right? Remember all those plagues? They went on Egypt. Did they go in Goshen? Did the flies go into Goshen, Ted? Did the frogs go into Goshen?
Some things did and some things didn't. I don't remember what that did.
Yeah.
I think at the beginning, some of that did, then they changed.
I know the water didn't, right? When the water turned to blood, right?
Yeah.
We might have to.
Which one's which? I can't remember.
We might have to look up all 10 of those, but here he's telling them that he gave them grace in front of the Egyptians. And he says it again in chapter 11, and then he says it again in chapter 12. Almost the same vernacular. Okay? So then, does anyone want to say anything else about that? Yeah. So, okay. So then, coming back to Romans 11 and Paul, this is the rest of that paragraph. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear. Have we talked about that before? I don't have to go over that again, right? Eyes that would not see, ears that would not hear. This is very common. We've talked about this thoroughly, right? And here, in typical prophetic and biblical fashion, he's not quoting from just one place. He's saying, look, this concept of the way God picks, shows his grace, it's everywhere in the Bible. He literally pulls this. I mean, these words can be found in multiple prophets as well as the Torah. And then he goes on to say the same concept the way David said it in the Psalms. So what's he doing here? He's saying that this concept, the way God chooses his elect, the way that God gives grace on his people and mercy, he does it comprehensively throughout the entire Bible. He's pulling these texts from the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Remember? The Torah, the prophets, and the writings. The writings are the Psalms, right? Who else did that? We talked about this like maybe 3 months ago. Remember, Jesus did this. He says, I think it was in John, but he says that Moses wrote about me, the prophets wrote about me, and even the Psalms. The entire Bible talks about this, okay? And Paul's doing the same thing, right? He's not quoting from random places throughout the Bible. He's quoting from the whole thing, okay? The Torah, the prophets, and the writings, all of the 3 major sections of the Jewish Bible, just like Jesus did. The whole Bible is saying the same thing about God's grace. Okay? So, any questions about that? That's the end of this call to seek the Lord section. And you can say, I don't know, that maybe it sort of runs into the last lamentation section. But any questions about that or this remnant theme? It's pretty interesting. I mean, you can track the way that moves throughout the entire prophets. And then throughout, Paul's not the only one to talk about it. Paul's not the only one to talk about it. So, wait a minute. Did I get out of it? Oh, I went too far, didn't I? Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so this last section. This is the last lamentation. This is how Amos closes his chiasm. Therefore, thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord, in all the squares there shall be wailing, and in all the streets they shall say, alas, alas. They shall call the farmers to mourning, and to wailing those who are skilled in lamentation. In all the vineyards there shall be wailing, for I will pass through your midst, says the Lord. Where have you heard this phrase, I will pass through, before? I had it up here a minute ago. In Exodus. It's actually, you've heard it twice, right? In 2 verses. But strangely, these are not the same words. You see, I will pass in yellow, I will pass in red. That's not the same Hebrew word. It's only the same in English. The difference is the through and the over. Okay? That's the difference. Okay? We can get this confused very easily reading this in English, but the Hebrews could not get this confused because they're completely different words. They're completely different sounding words, actually. But I won't go into that in huge detail. The difference between these 2 words is subtle in English, but it's very important. What's the difference between passing through something and passing over something? Well, when it's a holy God, it's a big difference. When it's a holy God that is passing through something or over something, it makes all the difference in the world. You see the significance that the Jewish holiday is called a Passover instead of the pass-through. I mean, if it was the pass-through, then none of us would be here to tell the story, would we? None of us would be here to celebrate that, right? What he does when he passes through is judgment. I mean, what does a holy God do in the presence of an unholy people? The unholy people cease to become people, right? That's what we're told. You cannot be in the presence of the holy God. So, by showing grace, he shows grace to us in the nation of Israel here, specifically, by passing over us. Okay? It's a different word. Only by the grace of God, as previously mentioned. In chapter 12, remember? That's one of the other places that, that's the last place that this word grace. Where am I? There we go. That's the last place that this word grace is used with the Israelite nation. In chapter 12, the Israelites are shown grace by being passed over instead of passed through. But now, 600 years or so, give or take, after this first Passover, in the day of Amos, it is this chosen people of God who have become the oppressors. Here's the word. By the way, this is a little bit interesting, I guess. This word passed through, it's sort of a common word. I don't know if the first time this is used, it might be the first time, but I don't remember specifically. One of the significant times this is used is in Genesis 18, when God, as the smoldering pot and the flaming torch, the fire, passed through the carcasses of the dead animal, the cut covenant with Abraham. It wasn't Abraham that passed through that, it was God, right? He passed through, right? And that passing through is significant of this judgment that will come, right? The judgment and the wrath and the penalty of our sin, who does it ultimately fall on? It falls on God. He takes that for us. He shows us grace by passing over us. But it can't pass. I mean, if he's just, you can't just disregard it completely. Sin has to be dealt with. Go ahead.
Genesis 18:17. It's 15:17.
Is it 15:17? Is that the cut covenant?
Chapter 15 is the cut covenant.
I'm sorry. That's a typo on my part. Thanks for pointing that out. 15:17. Sorry about that. That's what it is, though. It's in 15. Thanks. Just like Amos has already told them in chapter 4, he went through this whole thing, remember? Like, God has done this, he's done that. He's done all these different things. He sent them prophets, he sent them diseases, pestilence, the same thing that he sent the Egyptians. He's doing all these things to try to get his people to turn around. And we won't do it. We won't turn back to him. Therefore, prepare to meet your God. Therefore, God will pass through, right? That's what happens. That's what this lamentation is all about. You see, it's not just about the Israelites becoming like Egypt, right? Egypt is a type. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. It's Babel. It's Egypt. It's Babylon. It's Greece. It's Rome. It's everybody. It's what we do to each other, right? This is a theme that's repeated over and over and over and over again. All the way, I mean, you could make comparisons to Soviet Russia or communist China, things like, I mean, it's just the degeneration of humanity, right? You can make comparisons to our country, America, right? This is what humanity does, if not for the grace of God, and if not for the Spirit of God, if not by the will of God. So then, after this section right here, when he closes this chiasm out, he sort of kicks off this whole new theme that's totally related to this lamentation, which is, what's in verse 18? Oh, the first woe oracle. But it's, I got to make sure that I got this right, Terry, now that you corrected me once already. The day of the Lord. The first woe oracle is the day of the Lord. And this is a giant concept that Amos sort of begins. He names it for the first time. But it's something that, over a half dozen, I think 8 of the prophets talk about this day of the Lord. And then the gospel authors talk about this too. Okay? Any questions about that? I'm done with this. And I finished a little bit early. So if you don't have any questions, I'll talk about something else. Anything? Okay. So how many people are still doing the congregational Bible reading? You are. Anybody? How many people are still doing the congregational Bible reading? You guys know that we're doing a congregational Bible reading? Yeah? The calendars are on the back in there. We're in Luke, or I'm sorry, we're in Acts right now. So we're almost to the end, right? I think we got about 4 more months of this. So in a few more months, we're going to come to an end, a culmination, and we're going to start over again. Okay? If anyone would like to have input on what we do, before we did this one, we did a different plan. The what was that called? The Machine Bible reading plan. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But now we're doing a different plan. It's something set up by an organization that puts out a Bible. I mean, it's not a big deal. But if you want to be involved in that, it's going to be about 3-4 months from now, and we're going to have to talk about if we want to do the same thing again, a different thing again. But I think there's been a pretty big benefit that we've gotten from reading the Bible together. It's something that, I don't know, Jeremy got us started on maybe 3 years ago, I guess. And it's benefited my family greatly, okay? But I think that doing something intentionally to read the Bible in order every single day or, regularly throughout the week is something that is, it's sort of hard to be a Christian and not do that, Like, how do you be a Christian if you don't know what the Bible says, right? You can make something up. Yeah, particularly in order or the whole thing. Because what happens if we're left to our own devices, this is in a worst case scenario, but what happens when we're left to our own devices, what we do is we just read the things that we like, right? The narratives, the gospel, we'll just read the book of Mark over and over again. We'll read, the epistles, because discourse, we can understand that. We'll read, the Torah up until it gets too offensive, like Leviticus. That's really boring, so we skip over that. What?
23rd Psalm.
The 23rd Psalm, yeah, everybody likes that. Nobody knows what it means. But you've got to know the whole thing in context, right? So the parts of Scripture that get neglected are a lot of the Psalms and a lot of the prophets, like Amos, okay? So if you don't intentionally read through them, and I think you get a benefit by reading through them in order. That's sort of what we've discovered. Because the Bible is a story. It's not all narrative, but it's telling us a story in order, right? Amos doesn't riff off of Joel, right? Joel riffs off of Amos, and Amos riffs off of Moses. So you got to get it in that sort of. You don't have to read it in that order, but you have to think about it conceptually that way, because the day of the Lord is named with Amos, but it starts with Moses. It doesn't start with Mark. Mark just picks it up. Okay, so if any of you would like to get onto that. There's going to be more information coming out with the next couple months. And by all means, start it now. If you're not doing anything intentionally right now, there's calendars in the back, or talk to me offline, and we can talk about it more thoroughly. And we can get you plugged into that pretty easily. Go ahead.
Are you talking about the calendar in February that's got the scripture in it? Is that the calendar you're talking about?
It's on the bulletin board in the back, and yes, that's the one. It's posted on the bulletin board in the back, and then below that is some pamphlets, the same thing. So you can take one of those if you want. Don't take the last one. If it's the last one, make a copy.
Cheers making some copies.
Oh, okay, good.
So, people that are watching, that aren't here, that are going to be a while before they come here or whatever, they might need to know a way to get in contact, and that maybe you can send something to them electronically. So,
Email me or call me or text me. I don't have it up here, but on the slide, before we start the 11 a.m. service, my phone number is on there. So you can, and maybe my email, I don't know, right? It would be pretty easy to get my email or my phone number. Call me, text me, whatever, and it's super easy to get plugged into. I can email you a calendar, or it's an application on any device. Yeah. Anything regarding that? Anything else about Amos? Yeah, thank you.